Hello everyone, my name is Alex Godden and I am a Principal Consultant at Wessex Archaeology, and today I'm going to be giving you a talk on archaeology and folklore and about how the two disciplines often relate to each other and about how this has developed through time and how folklore and archaeology can still be of use in today's world. So first of all, I thought we'd start off by going through some definitions about what archaeology and folklore actually mean, because both of these are, in a way, studies of the past. So first of all, we go a definition of archaeology as the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. So to conclude there, archaeology is really a study of the physical remains of the past. Now for folklore, I've come up with two definitions, and both of these are pertinent to our discussion as we move forward. So first of all, folklore is seen as the study of the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. Also, folklore can be defined as a body of popular myths or beliefs relating to a particular place, activity, or group of people. Now, basically, as we're going to be talking about folklore and tales that have grown up around archaeological sites, that second definition, to say that it's relating to a particular place, I think is quite pertinent to our discussion going forward. Now, both of these, archaeology and folklore, both had a common ancestor in the antiquarianism of the 16th and 19th centuries, where both archaeological remains and folklore were studied for the same reasons, that they were both seen as relics of past cultures, archaeology being the physical remains, and folklore seen at the time as a remnant of past belief systems, or even a distorted memory of past events that had happened, as in that first definition there. So the stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. Now, that definition, the fact is that like folklore is actually a distorted memory of either traditional beliefs that has changed through time, or of a actual event that occurred in the past, is no longer believed in academic folklore studies today, because there are lots of different things that give rise to the creation of folklore. It's not necessarily a historical event, if that makes sense. But actually, that attitude towards folklore has resurfaced in another way today, which we will see later on in this talk. In fact, it was only really when you start to get the introduction of typological and chronological sequencing in archaeology, as in where you could absolutely date an archaeological site, that the two subjects began to separate, as archaeology began to see more of a science, and that folkloric descriptions of archaeological sites were not seen anymore as accurate representations of the past. So it's basically split into two different disciplines. So you've got archaeology and you've got folklore, and archaeologists have not really considered folklore as an accurate kind of, or as a worthwhile thing to include until recently. In the last few decades, I mean, the situation is now shifting back to a more cooperative way of working. So for the next hour or so, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to how archaeology and folklore can work hand in hand. So there are plenty of archaeological sites that have folklore attached to them. So first of all, we're going to start with barrows. Now I've called them the hollow hills there because in folklore, some folkloric representations, they are known as hollow hills. Barrows is a generic term which refers to prehistoric burial mounds, and many of them date to the Bronze Age or earlier. And there are surviving examples seen right across the United Kingdom. Salisbury Plain is a great place to see these. The association of barrows with folkloric elements goes back at least to the early medieval period in terms of written accounts. So you get these sort of Anglo-Saxon charters which describe mounds which are associated with suka or polka, which is Old English for a demon or a goblin. And Beowulf, the famous poem, in the poem, Beowulf must prove his kingship by fighting a dragon who guards treasure within a stone roof barrow. Now, there's also a wonderful account from the 7th century of St. Guthlac, who lived as a hermit on a burial mound, where he apparently fought the British-speaking demons who lived there. And there are also plenty of accounts from Saxon and Norse poetry and from the sagas of people who sleep on barrows to commune with ancestors and either go mad or receive wisdom. So this association carries on into the medieval period, where barrows are associated with buried treasure, but also with the supernatural creatures that inhabit them. For example, fairies, where barrows are seen as either the home of fairies or as a way into their world, almost like a portal or a gateway into fairyland. Here is a wonderful woodcut which actually describes a 12th century account by William of Newburgh, who spoke of a traveller who was enticed into a fairy mound by singing and dancing, and he goes in there and he joins the fairies in their wonderful revels, but then he's having an absolutely fine time until he decides to steal a gold cup. So again, you've got that idea of fairies and treasure within a barrow, and that. But once he steals the cup, he is then thrown out of fairyland because the fairies obviously don't like him doing that. And then when he comes back into our world, he finds that, like, years and years and years have passed. He only thought he was in fairyland for a couple of hours, but it turns out he was there for years. And that's a common motive that you get about the time passes differently in fairyland than it does in the real world. I came across an example of what I think is a similar legend in Hampshire when I was doing my master's research, because I was studying folklore and archaeology, where there is a ballad about a local lord who goes riding near the Popham Beacons in Hampshire. Now, the Popham Beacons are a Bronze Age barrow cemetery, but then he disappears, and his wife wonders where he's gone, and she eventually sort of like remarries, and then he reappears 7 years later, and he doesn't realize that he's been gone for all this time, and he ends up like killing his wife because she's married someone else, and there's lots of kind of like repercussions from his disappearance. But it's interesting, in the ballad it doesn't explicitly say that he was abducted by fairies or he went into fairyland, but it seems to be a coincidence to me that he disappears while he's near these barrows. So I wondered if there is a folkloric element hidden within that ballad, and again, the fact that he's gone for 7 years is actually quite illustrative as well, because 7 is considered to be a magical number in the medieval period. So this association carries on. There's a picture of the Popham Beacons there. There you go. They're still upstanding barrows. This association carries on into the post-medieval period and finds its way into the witch trials. So here you have a illustration of some witches dancing a circle. But if you see over there to the left of the illustration, there is a hill with a door in it. So again, you've got this idea that barrows are seen as this portal. There is a doorway into another world. And in fact, in some of the famous witch trials, this is actually mentioned. I mean, the trial of Isabel Gowdy, who confessed to witchcraft during the 17th century, apparently communed with spirits in the Hollow Hills again. And there was a cunning man called James Walsh, who lived in Netherbury, who was hauled up before the authorities in Exeter in 1566 and asked how he was able to commune with the fairies. And he replied that he speaketh with them upon hills where there are such great heaps of earth, namely in Dorsetshire. So again, it's very likely he is referring to Bronze Age barrows there, which are very common in Dorset. So again, you've got this continuation right through into the post-medieval period that fairies are inhabiting barrows and they can impart some sort of wisdom, to people who know how to speak to them. And this idea of treasure continues as well, with a large number of barrows across the UK which are supposedly contain some form of treasure, such as a golden throne or a golden calf. Here is a kind of biblical illustration of the golden calf, which Moses' people were worshipping when he was up on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments. I mean, it's tempting to suggest that this idea of treasure in barrows is a continuation of Saxon myths, or again this memory of burial, goods being hidden in barrows. But this is actually probably more a representation of there are these ideas that Catholics during the Reformation were actually hiding their treasure, their golden images from, you know, Protestant reformers. And so this idea of golden images is very much tied up into the idea of graven images and popery, but also concepts of punishment. So these places where these papists, these evil papists, hide their treasures in barrows, and barrows are seen as kind of like liminal places of punishment as well. For example, barrows are often where criminals are executed as well. So so there's all these different elements that are kind of like combining to create the folklore of burial mounds. And later stories actually also associate barrows with battles, as in this is where the dead from battles are buried, and particularly from the Civil War. And I'll come back to this point later on in my talk. So moving on, talk about some of the sort of like supernatural creatures that are also associated with prehistoric sites and archaeological sites. Barrows and other monuments are often associated with quite a few supernatural entities. For example, giants. Now, giants can be found everywhere in the landscape. Long barrows, which are a Neolithic burial mound, so earlier than the Bronze Age ones, are often called giants' graves. And here is an example of one near Old Winchester Hill, which is named, if you look on Ordnance Survey mapping, it's called the Giant's Grave. Now, often these giants, you know, they are thought to be buried there because of the size of them. You know, I mean, these are great big long earthen mounds, so it makes sense that people would interpret these as being this is where a giant is buried. But there's also, this is in Downton, up on the edge of the New Forest, where you've got not only a giant's grave, long barrow, but also a giant's chair. So again, you've got this interpretation where you've got these Bronze Age barrows are associated with giants, one its grave, and the other places where I guess it used to sit. You know, so this obviously there was a giant living in this area, at least according to folklore. But giants are also known in folklore to create round barrow cemeteries by throwing them, by hurling clods of earth at each other, usually in competition with another giant, or sometimes by having jumping competitions. So they use these barrows to jump across to kind of outbest each other. And this is in a part maybe stemming from a medieval writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote in his History of the Kings of Britain that England was ruled by a race of giants before Brutus and his Trojans arrive and kick them out. So this was for a while considered to be an official historical account of the history of England, at least until during the medieval period. So maybe this is why people are seeing giants in the landscape everywhere. Oh well, there's a great big mound there. That must be where the giant that Geoffrey of Monmouth refers to in his official history is buried. So it's sort of like this kind of like a view into the medieval mindset, if you will. They also, as well as giants, also the devil is also very, very predominant within folklore in this country, and he makes quite a few appearances, often doing the same sort of thing that giants do. For example, this is Silbury Hill, which is a very well-known artificial mound near Avebury in Wiltshire, and but this was actually created, according to legend, by the devil, who was in the process of carrying a giant lump of earth, which he was actually going to dump on Marlborough, which is a few miles to the east of Silbury Hill, when some local priests held up a candle to a cockerel and caused it to crow. So the devil heard this cock crowing and thought morning was coming. Now he doesn't like morning. Sunlight banishes the devil. He's afraid of it. So he got scared and he dropped the mound of earth, and that's why you got Silbury Hill there, because you've got this giant mound of earth, because that's what he was originally going to drop there. So again, and then you've also got going back to barrow cemeteries again. There's the Devil's Jumps near Traford in West Sussex, which is another linear barrow cemetery like the Popham Beacons. And according to that story, the god Thor used to sit on Traford Hill, and then one day the devil saw these 5 barrows and started to jump across them in order to amuse himself, and this really, really angered Thor, who threw a stone at the devil, which caused him to flee. So again, you've got this kind of incorporation that the devil into landscape landscape features, but it's also in all these stories, like Satan or the devil is a fool and a coward. So again, it's this kind of nice insight into this kind of contemporary mindsets that, like, the devil can be banished by light or by being tricked or outsmarted. So again, it's this view into the kind of medieval or post-medieval mind about attitudes towards the devil. So moving on to another type of archaeological site that often attracts legends, we're going to talk about stone circles. Now, there are plenty of folkloric associations with this, and this could be a bit like barrows in a way, that maybe because they tend to stand out in the landscape. Stone circles don't really blend in too much. They were designed to be seen by their builders in prehistory, and they do still stand out today. So lots and lots of stories attach themselves to stone circles. First of all, again, Geoffrey of Monmouth, going back to our historian, he wrote that Stonehenge is supposed to have been built by Merlin using magic powers. So again, but also sort of stated not only were the stones built using magic, but that the stones themselves had inherent magical properties. And this is quite a common folk story that you get attached to not only stone circles, but also individual stones as well, individual sarsen stones. And that not only that they can't be counted, for example, that it's impossible to count the number of stones in a stone circle. You cannot do it for some unidentified reason, but also that the stones themselves have a certain life force of their own, as in that they can sometimes move, they can get up. Usually when midnight strikes at a local church, they will get up and they will wander down to a local river to drink, or that they will turn around, or they will jump up and down. And this kind of, again, it implies that they're not only magic, but they have some form of consciousness, if you will, which is an interesting one. This is a picture of a stone circle that used to exist in Bramdean, again in Hampshire. I came across it when I was doing my MA research. Now, interestingly enough, there's William Cobbett records that when he was riding through Hampshire in the mid 1800s, that he saw this stone circle, and he asked a local peasant or something, like, oh, tell me about this stone circle. And the peasant apparently said, oh yes, those stones cannot be counted, and they were built by the Druids. So again, there was this kind of, like, in the 19th century, there was obviously this folklore that was regarding the stone circle. But what's interesting, this stone circle isn't actually that old, or it wasn't at the time. It was actually built as a folly by a local landowner as a monument to his favourite horse in the late 1700s. So it's interesting that this folklore had already been attached to the stone circle, even though it must have existed in living memory, maybe even of the man who gave this story to William Cobbett. So again, just shows how this folklore gets imbued quite quickly. So again, it's not a memory of a past event, or it's something that's kind of like just gets attached quite quickly. And this idea that stones are alive in some way is linked to another common stone circle legend, that stone circles or stones are actually the remains of people who have been turned to stone for some reason. Here is a picture of the Rollright stones in Oxfordshire, which is supposedly a king and his knights that were tricked by a witch, and saying, and I can't remember how the ballad goes. Apparently, it's that they if this person who wanted to be king, he said, if I can see this certain town by a certain time of day, then I will be king of England. The witch tricked him to delay, and as a result, him and his knights were turned to stone. So, and again, I've come across stories in Hampshire of individual sarsens that are supposed to be people that are turned to stone because they again upset the fairies, is one reason, or that they were doing something on the Sabbath, as in they were dancing or they were having a wedding. So again, it's this kind of insight into not obeying religious viewpoints at the time, contemporary religious kind of like laws, and as a result, you were punished, you were turned to stone. Not by God, it does seem, but it's usually by fairies or by witchcraft. So that's another interesting insight. but you know, not all of these stones have necessarily have kind of like bad stuff attached to them. There's also you get also stories of that stones have magical healing properties. This is an engraving of the Tolven stone in Cornwall, which is a hold stone. And basically, the story is that if you have a sick infant and you pass it through the hole of the stone, then it will become well again. So again, this idea, and that dates to the 19th century, and so again, well, this is recorded in the 19th century by folklorists. So again, you've got this idea that these stones are magical; they have some sort of magic, you know, inherent magical properties to them, which again is interesting. So moving on, and while we're still talking about supernatural properties of sites, this is another one, and this is a kind of like a certain subset of folklore, which is about relocation of sites, basically. So here is an aerial view of Old Winchester Hill, which is a very, very nice Iron Age hill fort in Hampshire, which also has within it a number of prehistoric barrows. These barrows, again, these burial mounds. Now, interestingly, I didn't come across any sort of like folklore in my research that has the devil or fairies in these mounds. And what the interesting tale is that this is actually known as the original site of the city of Winchester. Hence the name Old Winchester Hill. And the fact is that every single time when the people were trying to build the city of Winchester, they were building this location, but overnight, all the building materials mysteriously moved to where the city is now. So eventually the builders take the hint and start building it at the site of Winchester as it is now. So again, there's never any kind of like reason for why the building materials move, why, you know, some unknown power did not want Winchester to be built here. But there may be a hint isn't recorded in the folklore is in another similar tale, which is for Christchurch Priory near Bournemouth, where again the builders are trying to build the priory, and every single night things are moving. And then but what they notice is when they go to this other site where the stuff is magically appearing, there is this lone carpenter there who is working throughout the night and building stuff all on his own. And the suggestion is this lone carpenter is actually Jesus Christ, who has materialized on earth because he wants Christchurch Priory to be built at this location, not at the location where the stuff is moving from. So maybe there's a similar thing there with Old Winchester Hill, where you know, Jesus or God did not want Winchester to be built at that location. He wants to be built at the location where Winchester is actually built. So that's why these things are moving. So again, an interesting insight into people's attitudes at the time. So we're going to move slightly away from, although not entirely, from supernatural elements of legends attached to archaeological sites. And now we're going to talk about historic persons. Now, these can be either real persons or they can be imagined persons. And again, you know, this again ties in this early notion about in folklore, so that folklore was a memory of real events. So maybe it was thought at the time that some of these sites that have these people associated with, this is because they actually were at these places. But as we'll see, this is probably not the case. For example, hill forts, Iron Age hill forts around the country. Many of them are named after King Arthur or Caesar. So lots of Caesar's Camp. This is Caesar's Camp near Folkestone, and Cadbury Camp in Somerset, which is another Iron Age hill fort, is supposedly the site of Camelot. So again, we're tying into the Arthur legend now. Obviously, Caesar was a real person. The jury is still out on whether King Arthur was a real person. So, but again, this is not that Caesar did not have any direct relation. He did not build these hill forts, and so again, it's probably a folkloric association that we have going on here. There's also an interesting legend that Silchester, which is a Roman town in northern Hampshire, is where King Arthur was crowned by Merlin. Although it's also supposedly where a giant called Onion used to live. Up until the early 20th century, Roman coins found in the area were called onions pennies. So again, probably not any realism in either of those stories. Now, Hampshire has has an interesting legendary figure called Sir Bevis of Hampton, who was either a giant or a human of giant stature who regularly fought actual giants. There's lots of stories of him having these fights with giants, and again, he's immortalized in a lot of ballads and legends from the medieval and post-medieval periods, but also there's a long barrow on Portsdown Hill overlooking Portsmouth, which is known as Bevis's grave. So again, you've got this idea that he was a giant himself, and that's where he was buried, in this giant long barrow, this Neolithic long barrow. And there's also Bevisbury Camp, which is again is an Iron Age hill fort on the Hampshire-Wiltshire border. So again, there's association of this legendary person with a large archaeological monument in the site. So this was his camp. It wasn't, because it's Iron Age. Even if Sir Bevis was based on a real person, who was most likely to be medieval. So again, it's this association which isn't actually based in any kind of fact. Robin Hood is another one. Again, the jury is out on whether Robin Hood was actually a real person or not, but there were definitely plenty of medieval ballads associated with him, describing his exploits. And there are also plenty of archaeological sites which are associated with Robin Hood. So you get lots of examples of his grave, his butts, and his balls. Now, it's interesting because the latter is sometimes because of a throwing competition, as in Robin picks up a clod of earth and throws it, much like a giant. So again, that kind of like these legendary, almost supernatural powers are being associated with who was allegedly an actual just a normal bloke. And the butts are basically where he had his archery competitions. These would be targets that he'd fire his arrows at. So again, this is actually surprisingly well spread across the country. Actually, I mean, this example here is from a site in Sparsholt, just outside Winchester, which is quite a way south from Sherwood. So, but again, it shows that these associations are being made to prehistoric barrows. This is a prehistoric barrow. So again, this widespread association of legendary figures with these kind of sites. And then you get Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell obviously was a genuinely real person, and he becomes associated with a great deal of sites, strangely enough. I mean, sometimes in a negative sense. I mean, he's seen as Oliver Cromwell came into the church and smashed it up. So again, is there this kind of memory of this kind of Puritan destruction of what was seen as papal imagery. But it's actually associated with quite a few prehistoric sites as well. There are a number of Oliver's batteries around, these supposedly sites where his guns were set up, which generally turn out to be prehistoric. I mean, there's an Iron Age enclosure on the edge of Winchester called Oliver's Battery, which is definitely Iron Age. It's not Civil War, but interestingly, archaeological evidence of a Civil War execution was found in a barrow not far away, actually. So maybe it was reused, but there's been no evidence that it was specifically built by Oliver Cromwell. This is another interesting example that I came across, which is actually depicted on a map, which is Thomas Milne's map of 1791. And this is St Catherine's Hill, which again is a Iron Age hill fort on a natural hill outside of Winchester. No evidence I'm aware of that there was any Civil War defences actually there. But what you see here is what appears to be a typical Civil War period fortification, and it's called Cromwell's Camp. Now, my hunch is that there never actually was a camp up there, but that it may be that the Iron Age ramparts have been reinterpreted in a associative sense. Like, this is Oliver Cromwell. Look at these great big banks and ditches, because they're quite pronounced on Catherine's Hill. That Oliver Cromwell must have built these. So again, it's this kind of historical association. So an interesting one. An interesting one. Moving on, we're talking about his supposed historical association. We're going to talk about Druids for a little bit. Now, Druids, as well, even to the present day, have a strong association with stone circles and certain other monuments, and this really begins to start happening during the 16th century. And this is the first association of Druids with stone circles, and this begins with the antiquarian John Aubrey, who decided or attributed Stonehenge and Avebury, these very prominent stone circles, saying, well, these must have been built by Druids. And this was kind of based on the accounts by contemporary Roman historians about Druids, and this idea that they were this kind of this Iron Age priesthood. And the fact is that this association was made, saying, well, these stone circles must have been built by Druids, and this kind of sticks, this idea, this association, and this goes right through to other later antiquarians. Although it must be said that there were competing theories that the stone circles may have also been built by the Danes, but also by Phoenicians. So there's lots and lots of ideas kind of knocking about at the time, because obviously this is before archaeological investigation and dating, so the actual dates and construction methods of these monuments could not be verified at the time. So then you get William Stukely later on, who again champions this theory and puts it forward, saying, if you see here, there's Silbury down to the south there, and the fact that Avebury was actually this kind of serpent temple, and he championed this idea in the 18th century. That's saying that these were built by this kind of like advanced priesthood during the Iron Age. And again, this becomes very synonymous with popular culture. I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier about the Bramdean example, that relatively modern stone circle, but again, the locals like, oh, it was built by the Druids, it must have been built by the Druids, even though it had actually been built 30, 40 years beforehand. So again, it becomes kind of locked into popular culture. And of course, this continues to the day. With the modern day association of Druids and pagan groups with Stonehenge. I mean, to be fair, the vast majority of these modern pagan groups do not believe that Stonehenge was built by Druids. But what the idea is now is that these is continuing to renovate stone circles as sacred spaces, places of worship, and that's really the core kind of link that they're now making, as opposed to claiming that stone circles were built by Druids. Although there are some that say, well, Druids probably worshipped at these stone circles during the Iron Age, but again, that's quite conjectural. And this kind of moves on into the 20th century, where folklore is now kind of developing. So if you see to this point, you've got this kind of link where you've got these kind of medieval accounts of kind of like magic and supernatural powers and supernatural beings, which is now kind of morphing into, well, these sites are being used by contemporary priesthood, prehistoric wise men, if you will, because of the magical associations and the power inherent within them. And this kind of gets taken through into the 20th century. First of all, with the idea of ley lines. By the way, the idea of Druids now has kind of morphed into a larger idea of a Europe-wide astronomer high priest caste who directed the construction of these stone circles. So ley lines was originally thought up by a chap called Alfred Watkins, and he came up with the idea of this in the 1920s. His idea of ley lines were that these were that prehistoric and later sites were built on straight lines, which were laid out by surveyors in order to help travel. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and these were used as almost as visual marker places as you're moving through the landscape. He kind of dragged later sites such as medieval churches into this, because the idea he had this idea that these churches were all built on earlier pagan sites, or earlier prehistoric sites. But bear in mind that at no point did Alfred Watkins suggest that these ley lines are in any way magical. His theory for them was purely practical, based on travel through the landscape, and it was largely ignored at the time. His ideas were largely ignored by archaeology. Was starting to become more of a science, and it was kind of, his ideas were sort of like really ignored. But then it gets picked up by New Age and counterculture groups in the 1960s. And what you start happening here then is that the idea of ley lines was then kind of like linked into this kind of like burgeoning ideas about that there is magical earth energy, that the earth is a living thing, the Gaia hypotheses, and that these ley lines are lines of mystical earth energy, which sacred sites such as stone circles were built on so that they could tap into that energy by the people using the stone circles. So then what you start happening there is that people start reinterpreting folklore, as in the folklore of the healing properties of Stonehenge, or that they were barrows were the portals to the fairy world, as again memories of real events, not memories of fairies, but memories of this earth energy, this mystical earth energy. So again, you get this resurgence in the idea that folklore is a garbled recollection of actual events. And this basically develops further and further. I mean, here's an example of a supposed ley line that runs all the way from East Anglia right the way down to Cornwall. And that is a long, long thing for prehistoric people to survey. And there's all sorts of there's castles involved in it. There's churches. There's stone circles, and you know, it's a very convenient envelope theory to sort of lump all of these different period things into one thing. But again, if you're a new age, you know, alternative archaeologist kind of believer in earth energy, you can say, well, that's because all these things are built on the earth energy. The earth energy inspired the builders to place these sites here. And this just this kind of like comes up into this idea, this golden age of prehistory, where Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples lived in harmony with Mother Earth and knew how to tap into earth energy for all sorts of things. So these folklore of healing stones, moving sartans, buried treasure, you name it, is all a distorted memory of earth energy rituals. And you then even UFOs get dragged into it, where basically the idea that UFOs are using earth energy and ley lines as ways of traveling along. They almost like absorb the energy, and that these, you know, it's almost like Neolithic, you know, prehistoric power grid that the UFOs are using this. So it's all this stuff starts to come together, and you start. So again, you've got these prehistoric sites in landscape which are being interpreted, you know, every single sort of like period of history, they're being reinterpreted in a different way, you know, in a folkloric fashion. So again, you say this is all sort of happened in the 1960s and 70s, and then it all starts to kind of vaguely die out, and no one's really into it that much, although there are some people that are. But then that again evolves again into what I would consider to be modern folklore. So the idea of like kind of like Atlantis and ancient astronauts and all this kind of wonderful stuff that the people are writing books about as we speak. The ancient astronaut idea, championed by Eric von Däniken in the 60s, is still kind of knocking about. The idea that like a lot of these great archaeological sites around the world, they couldn't possibly have been built by the cultures that existed at the time. They must have had help from aliens, you know, which is actually kind of like, there's an interesting kind of like almost like subtext of racism there, you know, this kind of white colonialism, because, you know, people who in the 19th century, white explorers that traveled to places like Great Zimbabwe and saw these wonderful ruins, I thought, well, the local black people couldn't have built these, it must have been Phoenicians, or it must have been this, so, which is utterly ridiculous, of course, you know. And it's a similar sort of idea, the fact that aliens must have built these things. This is an example of, this is a picture of the Pakal sarcophagus cover, which is a Mayan tomb from Mayan king. And, you know, to an archaeologist or, you know, an ethnographer, you look at this and say that is a depiction of the god Pakal going into the underworld. But to Eric von Däniken and your ancient astronaut supporters, that is a picture of the king in a rocket ship at the controls. So again, it's all about interpreting symbols to whatever your particular theory is. I think archaeology has pretty much proved that none of these sites were actually built by aliens or with the help of aliens, but there you go. And then this also moves into the idea that it wasn't aliens that was helping primitive people to build these things. It was also some sort of vanished super civilization. Atlantis is a common one. That the civilization no longer exists, but we can see the remnants of their architectural style and their skills in these monuments. I mean, there's this idea that the three pyramids on the Giza compound are actually aligned to Orion's belt, which has got some sort of you know, there is some sort of like weight to that. If you know, again, the jury's sort of out on that. But again, archaeology has proved that these weren't built 12,000 years ago, you know, and they weren't built by a super advanced civilization who use anti-gravity technology. That, you know, that these were built by flesh and blood Egyptians. And again, it's this kind of this ongoing assumption amongst the fringe community that the Egyptians couldn't possibly have built the pyramids. They just appear overnight, which again is not true, because you look through Egyptian archaeology and there are plenty of examples of earlier versions of pyramids that didn't work and were redesigned. So again, there's no real water to this theory. And the idea of this super civilization, the fact that it existed thousands and thousands of years ago, then it was wiped out by some sort of cataclysm. And the current one that is knocking about is about that there was a super civilization that was wiped out by a comet approximately 12,000 years ago, if I remember right. This is the latest theory that's doing the rounds is about this site, which is Göbekli Tepe, which is a genuinely excellent and really, really cool site discovered in Turkey, which is archaeologically pushing back our concepts of development of monumental architecture in that type of the world. But it wasn't built by the contemporary Turkish civilization. It was built by a super advanced civilization wiped out 12,000 years ago, and it's built as a warning to us for this comet when it's going to come back. And apparently, this stela here, which is at Göbekli Tepe, apparently tells us all about that, which I struggle to see how that depicts a comet impact and a warning of how we can prepare for it. But there you go, you know. So I mean, basically, so what you've got here is that you can sort of like trace this association of archaeological sites and with folklore, with myths and legends, like going way, way back. And I'm absolutely certain that it was happening prior to written records as well. I'm absolutely certain. I mean, like this idea that monuments are created or interpreted in the landscape because of this way of how people view the past, and the way that people viewed the past before the advent of scientific archaeological investigation and dating techniques is that, well, if you don't know who built it, then it's very easy to ascribe it to a mythical origin. It's gods, it's demons, it's monsters, it's super civilizations. And there's no real excuse for these modern guys writing this kind of stuff, because archaeology can show exactly when things were built, but they still crack on with it, basically. But it's not just legends and folklore. I mean, there's also actually archaeological evidence of folkloric beliefs. A favourite of mine is revenant burials. Now, revenants are animated corpses which return from the living, and this is widespread folkloric belief around Europe, and it later kind of like changed into things like the vampire myths and things like that. But there's the idea of the Draugr in Norse mythology, which is this kind of zombie creature which again inhabits burial mounds, and there's accounts of the 12th century onwards. But you do get these burials which are found in the archaeological record which appear to be specifically these burials have been done to try and keep these people in the grave so they don't rise up again. You get Roman accounts of this, of people with heavy stone slabs put on their chests, or the head is removed and placed between the feet, so that when the revenant or vampire wakes up, it can't find its head, so it'll get lost and it won't attack people. There's all sorts of things you can infer into this. And interestingly, relatively recently, the last couple of years, there've been some excavations at Warren Percy, which is a deserted medieval village in North Yorkshire, and the post-excavation analysis of the human bones found in there, which are medieval, which is carried out by Historic England and the University of Southampton, suggests that the corpses were burnt and mutilated. Now, many of the bones showed knife marks, suggesting that the bodies had been decapitated and dismembered. And there's evidence of burning of body parts and deliberate breaking of some bones after death. Now, this could be interpreted as evidence of cannibalism. You know, food was running low, and so the residents of Warren Percy revert to cannibalism. But there's no corroborative evidence of this. The knife marks are not around any of the major muscle attachments or large joints, which is what you tend to find with evidence of cannibalism. But it's around the head and the neck. So these weren't being mutilated and cut up to be eaten; they were being done for some other reason. Another idea is that maybe these were outsiders, so they're treated differently when they're buried. But there's some strontium isotope analysis been carried out. This is a no, that these people were actually locals. They were born and bred in the village. So this treatment of the bones seems to be consistent with medieval cures, if you will, for walking corpses, for revenants. So, and there were 10 individuals. So for some reason, these 10 individuals were considered to be, there was a danger that they were going to rise from the grave and go wandering about harming the living, and so they were treated in this way. So that is clear. That is archaeological evidence for that. Another one is, which is another favourite of mine, is witch marks. Now these are commonly called apotropaic marks. This comes from the Greek apotropaios, meaning to ward off evil. And these tend to date from the 16th, 19th century, and are quite widespread. They're often found scratched into door frames, windowsills, or chimney lintels, fireplaces, anywhere that a witch or an evil spirit or a demon could gain entrance to a room or a house. There's lots of different forms. I mean, this one here depicted is the daisy wheel, which is quite a common one. Or another one is these overlapping V's, which are known as Marian marks, and these are believed to be the initials of the Virgin Mary. So carving these in is almost invoking the Virgin Mary to protect the site where marks are found. And again, this is a fascinating insight into popular superstitions of the past, and they really are quite common. I mean, anyone who's listening, the next time you're in a church, keep an eye out for them, because you'd be surprised how much they are around, or even houses that date to this period. I mean, I found examples when I was working in West Berkshire in Shaw House, which is an Elizabethan Tudor manor, and they were carved into the door frame around what was the buttery. So again, obviously you can infer that there was a worry that witches or demons or evil spirits would have come in and spoiled the dairy products for the house. So these marks were carved around the outside of the door to protect the butter. And I was actually on holiday in France once, and I found some daisy wheels in the windowsill of a house there. So it's quite widespread. It's quite common. There's lots of excellent projects being done to kind of survey these. So, but I do urge you that if you're ever in a church or a kind of 17th, 18th century building, National Trust or something, keep an eye out. Keep an eye on the windowsill, see if you can find any. So, I mean, what is happening here? I mean, why does folklore get attached to monuments in the landscape? There are, there are these kind of ethnographic comparisons you can make. It's quite a common thing. I mean, there's the Native American attitude towards the landscape has these things called Manitou stones, where these are sometimes deliberately placed or naturally occurring lumps of rock, a bit like our stone circles in a way, which are inscribed with these magic powers basically. And there's a whole wide range of myths that the native Australians, the Aboriginal mythologies apply to the landscape. This idea of this dream landscape where these legendary locations are infused directly into it. But can we see this folklore association as something similar? I mean, it can be argued that folklore has been and still is, an important factor in the way that people experience places and monuments in the landscape. Again, it can't be claimed anymore really that folklore is a distorted memory of past events or beliefs, and that's kind of led to the alienation of folklore in the minds of archaeologists, and also the adoption of folklore by the fringe community, as we discussed earlier. But I think we can't reject folklore. As archaeologists, we can't reject folklore wholesale, because again, it's this idea of how people interpret the landscape around them. And almost making sense of the landscape. Why are there these lumps and bumps in the landscape? Oh, well, I don't know what built them, so therefore it must be gods or giants, And you can see by the amount of people that go to Avebury and still perform New Age rituals there. There is still this kind of association, this kind of mystical association, legendary association with this archaeological site. And again, it's this, folk tales, this idea of making sense of landscape. It's about past events. Do you kind of link past events to these monuments? And this and these events can be either real or imagined. you know, and are there these archaeological sites almost act as a kind of focus for memory, a materialization of memory, and fix social and individual histories in place. Good example is the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War was a, you know, absolutely cataclysmic event in, you know, in British history, and yeah, and it does become embedded not only in kind of like actual histories written at the time, but also in folklore. This is another example in Hampshire, and this is Cheriton, where there was a reasonably significant Civil War battle in 1645. Now, local tradition states that there is that a large mound on the edge of the village is the burial place of the soldiers that died in the battle. But whereas what we actually know from archaeological excavation is actually a Neolithic long barrow. So again, this predates the actual Civil War battle by, you know, thousands of years. And but the folklore again has made sense almost like of the slaughter and say, well, this is where these soldiers were buried. So it becomes like a memory peg for a real historic battle, even though the event is imaginary. And similarly, there are some mounds in the woods over there to the east, which is supposed to be where the generals are buried. So the soldiers get a communal burial in the giant mound. The generals get their own individual burial mounds. Now, these mounds haven't been investigated archaeologically, but what I did look at is find evidence that actually the wider landscape was actually originally a wider barrow cemetery, which has since been ploughed out. You can look at crop mark evidence, and it's very, very likely that these mounds were probably part of this wider barrow cemetery. So again, they're not Civil War burials of generals. They are in fact prehistoric barrows, which again have been interpreted in a folkloric context related to the Civil War. So, so I think that's maybe what led to the tradition, you know, or the idea that these are anchors of memory, if you will, which is again is interesting that happened. So in this way, we'll say, you know, really that monuments, if we're going to conclude, and if we can, with folklore is such a ephemeral subject, that it forms a kind of text almost within the physical environment. You know, it's a way that people almost write imagined histories, but do it by ascribing these legends to these monuments. And folklore becomes, by these monuments mean different things to different people. Folklore becomes a way of reading this text, which often is a different interpretation to what the original builders, you know, thought for it. But in a way, it becomes part of the biography of a site. You know, so I would argue that as such, folklore should be included in any archaeological historical study of a monument, not because, you know, there's any chance to find physical proof of a legend, but more that it can give us, it's part of the cultural history of the site, you know, a continuity of place, if you will. And landscapes have been inspiring stories throughout human history. Just, you know, just go look at Thomas Hardy and Wessex, you know, and both archaeology and folklore ways that we can interact with those landscapes. You know, form this continuity place, form this shared past, if you will. I'm just going to end on like a lovely kind of like story here where there was a very, very cool archaeological project carried out across the South Downs National Park a few years ago called The Secrets of the Woods, where they use LiDAR, which is a way of bouncing lasers through tree cover to kind of pick up earthworks on the ground to identify new sites. And then it was ground truth using an archaeological survey undertaken by community groups. So amongst a huge amount of new sites that were found in the woods of the New Forest of the South Downs National Park, was a new round barrow, and the volunteer who found it was allowed to name it. And this is a picture of it here, and he actually named it Grendel's Grave. Now, Grendel was the monster from Beowulf, and so this is obviously, you know, maybe this is how all traditions started. This is maybe the start of a new tradition here, that in, you know, 100, 200 years now, people were looking at it and going, oh, I wonder if there was folklore about Grendel being buried in the South Downs National Park, you know, and this is where his grave was. So it's just a wonderful kind of like example of how this idea of naming and interpreting and kind of like, you know, ascribing meaning to archaeological sites is still carrying up right up to the present day. So thank you. I hope that everyone's found that interesting. I I genuinely love this kind of stuff, and I still try to research it and talk about it whenever I can.